Regulation changes can mean the end of an era in more ways than one. Sometimes it's just to keep things fresh and it will end up getting rid of certain things that made certain cars what they were. Or it could just be a way of getting rid of obsolete technologies and ushering in a new era of modernity. Modernity. Modernness. Whatever that word is. For instance, in the previous video looking at Pirelli's dissolving tyres of 2011 and 2012, I briefly explained the rule changes that binned off all the aerodynamic appendages that were on the cars in 2007 and 2008, and were then replaced with smoother cars with big front wings and tiny rear wings to reduce the amount of rear downforce that was available. The thinking was if you had more downforce at the front and stripped some of the rear downforce away, the car would be twitchier on turn-in, and the teams would have to take front wing off to stop it spinning in the corners. But the gaping hole left in the rulebook led to the double diffuser, so the cars lost very little in the grand scheme of things. And more recently, we had the evolution from the big wide boy cars of 2017 to 2021 and replaced them with the ground effect era. An era that seems to have stabilised now, at least from the midpoint of 2024, but it remains to be seen if this will stay the same for 2025. We all want it to, because 5 drivers being able to win a race seems like a good idea, especially if those 5 win multiple races. Yeah, alright, make it 4 because Antonelli is still an unknown party at this point, but 4 is still better than 2 or 3, like, 2014 or 2023. But at the end of 2005, we said goodbye to one of the most beloved eras in Formula 1 history. When Fernando Alonso crossed the line to win the Chinese Grand Prix in 2005, it marked the last time that a V10 powered car would win a Grand Prix. It was also the first time since 1995 that a team that wasn't Williams, McLaren or Ferrari had won the Constructors' Championship. And there was me thinking that Formula 1 was super competitive in those days. Must have remembered it being different, but oh well, the days of the V10 were now done. Costs, fuel efficiency and environmental impact were all blamed, and with Formula 1 needing to be seen to be doing the right thing, the 3-litre 10-cylinder monsters were reduced to 2.4-litre V8s. Which sounds like a very specific number. Why 2.4, not 2.5? Answers on a postcard. At the same time, it was effectively the end of the era of the privateers in Formula 1. Minardi and Jordan were going to be gone. Eddie had sold his team towards the end of 2004, and it was Jordan in name only through 2005. Following the 2005 season, it would be Midland F1 before being rebranded Spiker for 2006 and 7, and then later became Force India, Racing Point, and is now Aston Martin. But to get the ball rolling on today's episode of Storytime, we need to go back towards the end of Minardi's life cycle. Minardi had always been a team that defied the odds. Most teams as underfunded as Minardi would have probably collapsed, but despite only scoring a handful of points in their time in Formula 1, while the likes of Williams, McLaren, Ferrari and so on racked up massive numbers of points, wins and championships, the plucky underdogs from Faenza in Italy soldiered on. They were in it simply for the love of racing, even if they were finishing last every week. Now there are some out there that say that some teams don't deserve to be on the grid because they're not winning races, like Williams, Haas, Sauber and so on. But if Formula 1 was a winners only club, then it would only be Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren and Aston Martin on the grid. Okay, Aston Martin has never won a race, but Fernando not won a race in 12 years Alonso gets a free pass. At the end of the 1990s, Minardi passed over to new owners. Giancarlo Minardi sold the team to Australian airline owner Paul Stoddart, who did have some success. Not so much on track, but in winding up Max Mosley to levels never seen before by any other man in the paddock. Ron Dennis was an amateur by comparison. Stoddart not only kept the team on the grid, but he succeeded in bringing through some future long-serving drivers. Mark Webber, the late Justin Wilson, and the already mentioned Alonso. But Minardi's presence was starting to not just rub the FIA the wrong way, but also the other teams. This was now the era of the manufacturers. By 2002, BMW was in partnership with Williams. Mercedes had a 45% or so stake in McLaren. Honda, Renault, Toyota and Ford had factory teams, and Ferrari was Ferrari. Sauber was to Ferrari what Haas is to Ferrari now, and it was leaving Jordan and Minardi languishing behind. Prost and Arrows had just gone under, so Bernie set up something called the Fighting Fund to keep those privateers alive. Story goes that if any of the teams fell into trouble, they could ask Bernie for some of this money. A bit like a payday loan, but it operated more like a grant. The issue was, the other teams had to vote on whether the team in trouble, Minardi in this case, should get that money. Because Minardi was holding the manufacturers back by voting against anything the manufacturers wanted because unanimous vote needed and things like that, the other teams would have rather seen Minardi die than survive, just so they could vote what they wanted through without the little guy getting in the way. And this is something that Stoddart did a lot. Even Eddie Jordan was against Paul Stoddart getting this money. Apparently, at the time, Eddie wanted Mercedes engines and he was doing everything he could to get those Mercedes engines. So to keep Mercedes on side, he would vote against Minardi getting that money in the same way that McLaren was likely voting against Minardi getting that money while being pressured by Mercedes to do so. But Eddie never got those engines, and then he lost bigly in court trying to take on Vodafone. So as it was, at the end of 2005, Minardi and Jordan were going to be done, getting their last points at the United States Grand Prix of 2005. Two of the most popular underdogs in Formula 1 history would be off the grid for 2006, as would the V10 engines. And it was a sad day for a number of occasions, considering that Jordan had enjoyed that 1999 season and won that Belgian Grand Prix. And Jordan was also the team that gave us Schumacher. And Minardi had endured over 20 years of racing at the top level and provided the sport with the likes of Fisichella, Webber, Alonso, Trulli, Martini and others. But what if I was to tell you that in the 2006 season, the V10s were going to stick around for just one more year? Now I know you might be thinking at this point, hang on a second, you said that in 2006 V10's gone, V8's in. If you try to run a V10 through 2006, you'll be disqualified from every session and you will be illegal. But the thing is, I haven't read the wrong tab on my browser at this point, nor have I read the wrong article on Autosport. This actually happened. In the latter part of 2005, Stoddart, much like EJ had done the previous year, swallowed his pride and sold the Minardi team. And there was interest from several sources, with Stoddart claiming he had at least 40 parties interested. But Stoddart, being a man of principle, said that he was only going to sell it to somebody who could take the team further and would also not abandon Minardi's home in Faenza so the existing personnel could still have a job. One of the people involved was apparently Eddie Irvine, who was also reported to have tried to buy out Jordan in 2004, this time going in for Minardi in cooperation with a guy who made his millions in vodka and a Russian bank. In the end, the successful bidder was Red Bull, who was looking to purchase Minardi and rebrand it as a B team so they could promote their own talent up into the senior team, with the senior team seats being filled by David Coulthard as the main driver and Christian Klein and Robert Dornbos in the other seat for 2006. For the B team's first season, Red Bull put Vitantonio Liuzzi and Scott Speed into the car, which was now called Toro Rosso because that's the Italian for Red Bull and the team would be based in Italy. Now the big question is, whatever happened to Scott Speed after he left Formula 1? Because the only thing he seems to have done of any note was get banned from iRacing for driving like a knob. But then again, it's iRacing. That could be literally anybody. But in the first couple of months of the team existing, there was already some commotion brewing. Okay, it wasn't exactly commotion, but it was more questions being asked, because Red Bull had done something quite clever. They'd been technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. If you remember the video I did talking about the 3 new teams that came in for 2010, there was supposed to be a team entering in 2008 called ProDrive, the team that built and prepped Colin McRae and Richard Burns' WRC winning Imprezas, and they've done many other things besides. David Richards was interested in entering Formula 1 and was hoping to do so with customer McLaren chassis, but the FIA and the Concord Agreement said that all cars must be built in-house and customer chassis are a no-go. Somebody else can build the chassis for you, as we see now with Dallara building Haas's cars for them, but there are rules and regulations about how they are designed and built. By all means outsource somebody to build your design, but buying stuff off the shelf? It's not the 70s, you can't just buy a March anymore. And ironically, the guy at the head of the FIA was the guy that founded March. Well, one of them anyway. The problem Toro Rosso had when their cars turned up to pre-season testing was that the cars looked suspiciously like the previous year's Red Bulls with a few modifications. And this raised a few red flags with the other teams, who immediately pointed to the rulebook and said, they've not designed this car, somebody else has. And Red Bull managed to wiggle out of it in the most Red Bull way possible. Basically, it's the advantage of owning 2 teams. Here's how they did it. Red Bull argued that the 2005 car was designed by Ford when they had the Jaguar team in 2004, and Red Bull bought Jag from Ford and created the now 6-time Constructors' Champions. When Red Bull bought Jaguar, the intellectual rights for what would have been Jaguar's 2005 car were then transferred over to Red Bull, and because Red Bull owned both the Red Bull Racing and Toro Rosso teams, it meant that those intellectual rights were, at least on paper, able to be applied to both teams' cars. Following? I hope so. Basically, Red Bull owned 2 teams, so they could run 4 cars exactly the same if they wanted to. But that wasn't the only issue that came up, because there was also the small issue of the rather large engine. Well, large compared to what it should have been in 2006 anyway. If Minardi had carried on into 2006, they would have received special dispensation to continue running the 3-litre V10s, albeit rev limited and also air restricted. The FIA had allowed this because teams like Minardi were genuinely struggling, with Jordan having already been sold, so there was a concession allowed to give Minardi an extra year to find the funds required to transition over to the V8s for 2007, assuming they were still around by this point. If Eddie Jordan still owned Jordan, they too would have been given this dispensation. This hit a nerve with Midland F1, which was the evolution of Jordan, and also Super Aguri, which was Honda's B team in 2006. Both teams argued that the concession that the FIA was going to give Minardi was for Minardi and Minardi only, so allowing this new team, bankrolled by Red Bull, was not part of the deal. Midland might have argued that, well, we're an evolution of Jordan, so we should also get V10s as well. Basically, what they were arguing was this new team should have been able to afford V8s, so why should they still get to use the V10 and save a bit of money? And to go back to the whole chassis cloning thing, it's not the first time that this has happened. Teams have bought up rights to unraced car designs or previous blueprints before Toro Rosso came along. Minardi had previously bought the A23 chassis and intellectual rights from Arrows when Arrows went bust midway through 2002, which later became the PS04, although modified slightly to have it not just be the 2002 Arrows, which was something that brought Minardi some negative press. In 2006, Super Aguri bought the A23s from Stardart that hadn't been modified to become the PS04 and modified them to conform with the 2006 rulebook. The same Super Aguri that was complaining that Toro Rosso got to use a V10 even though that rule was meant for Minardi, not Toro Rosso, when they themselves hadn't fully designed their own car. Formula 1 is just everybody dobbing each other in, isn't it? So then, that V10 engine. It had a 77mm air restrictor stuck on it and was rev limited to 16,700 RPM, way down on the 19k or so that had been in use in 2005 to keep the power levels around the same as the V8s. The issue that Toro Rosso was going to have is that over the course of the season, the other engine suppliers were going to be finding more power as they brought upgrades and did other bits and pieces to ensure reliability and keep things going, because Formula 1 was now in this use engine for 2 race weekends era. Also, those V8s were allowed to reach 20,000 RPM, which is an utterly insane number. Cosworth managed to hit it, apparently. And in case you're wondering what a choked V10 sounds like, you're in luck, because on Wikipedia, there's a free-to-use clip. But Super Aguri and Midland's concerns were for nothing. The engine manufacturers worked their magic and started to find more and more power to take them away from the rev and air limited Cosworth in the Toro Rosso. Because of the V10 being strangled, the traction control on the cars was holding it back too much, and the out-of-date chassis was leaving them with less development gains as well. Despite this, Toro Rosso was still more competitive than Spiker and Super Aguri, but scoring points was proving incredibly tricky. At some point during the season, Toro Rosso went to the FIA and asked for an extra 500 RPM. The FIA said, "Best we can do is 300, take it or leave it." Speed wasn't quite living up to his name, but he was returning some decent results, as was Liuzzi. When you're the first American on the grid since 1993, there are going to be a lot of eyes looking in your direction, because Michael Andretti had come over from kart and flopped. But on the other hand, Jacques Villeneuve and Juan Pablo Montoya had come straight over from kart and hit the ground running. Yes, Villeneuve's Canadian and Montoya's Colombian, but they'd made their names for themselves on the ovals of North America before coming into Formula 1. Both with Williams, as it so happens. Speed's first race in Formula 1 he finished 13th, which isn't that bad all things considered, and he's shown us finishing 9th in Australia, but this would have been 8th and a single point had he just kept his mouth shut. He overtook Coulthard under yellow flags and then proceeded to verbally abuse the Scot in the steward's room after the race, so he was given the 25-second penalty and a fine for the language used. If he'd done that today, there's no telling what might have happened to him. That said though, Jardio's just posted on Twitter somebody in the WRC has been fined for swearing. At the same time, there's guys in NASCAR that have been fined and docked points for swearing. But the rest of the season isn't actually that bad, considering they were a new team hamstrung with a car and engine that couldn't really be worked on properly. Speed was 9th in Australia, Liuzzi was 10th in Monaco, Germany and China, and then Speed finished 10th in Canada and France. And that would be points today, but this was an era where only the top 8 scored. They were, more often than not, inside or just on the edge of the top 10, which, like mentioned, isn't bad. Liuzzi got the team's only point of the season when he came 8th at Indianapolis. So 1 point, 9th in the Constructors, but a decent starting point, again, considering they had an older chassis and an older engine. The only negative mark against the performances was that on occasion the cars were involved in silly accidents, but this was just down to experience for the most part. Both drivers, in Speed and Liuzzi, were rookies and in their first F1 seasons, and Liuzzi tended to have the upper hand in qualifying, but as Speed got more experience and got used to the car, he would start to get there. As mentioned, the car was being held back due to the engine, the old chassis, and the torque advantage of the V10 being cancelled out by the traction control, which at this time was still in use, but would be banned at the end of 2007. The FIA actually did a great job with the engine equivalents. The V10 engine might have been a cause for complaint from Midland and Super Aguri, but it had absolutely no advantage on any of the other cars at any point of the season, and the Toro Rosso was a solid mid-grid car. They were slower than the Red Bulls, which is to be expected, but the gap between Toro Rosso and Red Bull was smaller than that between Super Aguri and Honda, although Super Aguri wasn't a B team in the same way. But Toro Rosso is still around. Sort of. It's had a few image changes, but it still serves as a breeding ground for Red Bull talent. Of the drivers on the 2025 grid, almost half of that grid has driven for the Red Bull B team in various guises over the years. Gasly, Tsunoda, Lawson, Albon, Sainz, Hadjar, Verstappen, and if you want to count Minardi in there as well, Alonso. Add to this there's the likes of Kvyat, Ricciardo, Bourdais, Vettel, Verne, Hartley and Alguersuari, with Vettel and Verstappen graduating from the B team to the A team and winning championships. And Gasly and Vettel have both won races for the B team. So Toro Rosso, RB, AlphaTauri, whatever we're calling them today, did what Stud Art wanted. They took the existing Minardi framework and improved on it. And I don't know about you, but I'd say they did that, and then some. So then, a look at the last ever V10 powered F1 car, the Toro Rosso STR1. If this has been informative and let you understand some of the bits and pieces of this time period and how they were able to get away with running a V10 when the rules quite clearly said a V8, then do like the video so I know I did a good job with, well, the video. For more stuff from the channel, hit that subscribe button and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here, from story time to current affairs stuff to live streams, whenever I do those. I didn't stream the IndyCar League at the weekend, but then again you missed nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was boring. But massive thanks as ever go over to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and for any Patreon contributions you can do all that by following the link down in the description, where there's also links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to top up my massive mug of coffee, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.